In the world of Jesus, money rarely jingled in pockets. It moved quietly, through temple courtyards, Roman tax ledgers, and whispered agreements between power and faith. Wealth wasn't just about gold or land. It was about proximity. To authority. To protection. To exemption. And for most people living under the Roman Empire, the economy wasn't something they studied. It was something they survived. A carpenter's daily wage could vanish before sunset, absorbed by taxes layered upon taxes, imperial, regional, religious. Farmers watched harvests measured not by abundance, but by what would be taken first. Merchants negotiated prices knowing that a single decree from Rome or Jerusalem could erase their margins overnight. And hovering over it all was a question that still feels unsettlingly modern: who does the system actually serve? This wasn't a primitive economy. It was sophisticated, bureaucratic, and deeply political. Coins carried propaganda. Tax policies enforced loyalty. Religious institutions doubled as financial centers. And beneath the surface, quiet economic pressures shaped social unrest, moral teachings, and ultimately, history itself. For ordinary families, these systems determined whether children ate. For elites, they determined who stayed elite. And for the empire, money wasn't just revenue, it was control. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the hidden mechanics of global finance. And tell us, what country are you watching from? As we peel back the numbers of the ancient world, ask yourself, could this kind of system exist today, just wearing a different name? The economy of Jesus' era didn't announce itself with markets or stock tickers. It revealed itself at dawn, when laborers gathered in dusty town squares, waiting to be chosen for a day's work that might barely cover a family's bread. Wages were negotiated quickly, often unfairly, because time itself was leverage. If you refused the offer, someone else would take it. Hunger had already done the math. At the center of this system was Rome, but Rome rarely collected money directly. Instead, it outsourced the dirty work. Provincial governors set targets. Local elites enforced them. Tax collectors, often locals themselves, paid Rome upfront for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the population to recover their investment. Every extra coin was profit. Every complaint was ignored. Economists today would recognize the structure instantly. It was efficient, brutal, predictable, and deeply destabilizing. Coins flowed upward, away from villages and into imperial vaults, but they also flowed sideways, into temples. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't just a religious center. It was a financial institution. It stored wealth, exchanged currencies, issued loans, and collected mandatory religious taxes. Pilgrims arriving with foreign coins were forced to exchange them at unfavorable rates. Sacrificial animals were sold at inflated prices. Faith and finance were inseparable, and everyone knew it. Ordinary citizens felt trapped between obligations. Refuse Rome, and you risked punishment. Refuse the temple, and you risked social and spiritual exile. Merchants adjusted prices quietly. Farmers hid portions of harvests when they could. Families planned marriages, children, and futures around tax seasons rather than hope. Some elites prospered spectacularly. Landowners consolidated property as debt swallowed small farms. Analysts of the time, scribes, scholars, officials, understood what was happening, even if they never said it aloud. Wealth wasn't being created. It was being extracted. And beneath this carefully managed order, resentment was compounding, slowly, invisibly, waiting for something to break. As pressure built on ordinary households, the first warning signs didn't appear as rebellion. They appeared as debt. Small debts at first, missed payments, borrowed grain, delayed taxes. Then larger ones. A failed harvest. An illness. A Roman levy raised without notice. Suddenly, land that had been in a family for generations became collateral. This is where wealth quietly changed hands. When farmers defaulted, landowners, often connected to Roman administrators or priestly elites, absorbed the property. Former owners stayed on as tenants, working soil they once controlled, now paying rent on top of taxes. From a distance, the countryside still looked productive. Up close, it was hollowing out. Investors of the era, though they didn't call themselves that, watched carefully. Wealthy families diversified into land because it was stable, enforceable, and protected by law. Coins could be seized. Crops could fail. Land endured. And the legal system favored those who already had it. In Jerusalem, the temple's treasury grew heavier. Offerings increased not because people were richer, but because obligations were non-negotiable. Religious leaders argued that these payments maintained order and purity. Privately, some worried the system was stretched too far. Others saw opportunity. Foreign markets felt the ripple effects too. Grain exports shifted. Trade routes adjusted. Roman officials noticed revenue targets being met, but only barely. They raised expectations again. Economists today would call it a feedback loop. The ancient world felt it as suffocation. Journalists of the time, historians, chroniclers, recorded rising tensions in careful language. Banditry increased. Radical movements gained followers. People spoke openly about injustice, but softly, always watching who was listening. By the time Jesus began speaking publicly, the economic atmosphere was already volatile. His parables about debt, wages, landowners, and taxes didn't land in abstraction. They landed in lived experience. What most people didn't realize yet was that the system itself was nearing a breaking point, and Rome was about to tighten its grip. Rome sensed instability long before open resistance appeared. Empires always do. And when revenue streams feel uncertain, they don't loosen control, they formalize it. Census records were updated. Tax categories refined. Levies standardized. What looked like administrative housekeeping was, in reality, a recalibration of extraction. Suddenly, taxes weren't just expected. They were tracked. Households were registered. Property boundaries measured. Occupations logged. For ordinary citizens, this was unsettling. Being counted meant being visible. And being visible meant being accountable, to payments you couldn't negotiate. Families whispered about assessments arriving higher than expected. Merchants noticed officials asking more questions than before. Farmers felt the pressure months before harvest, not after. Investors and landowners responded strategically. Some liquidated assets, moving wealth into forms easier to hide or transport. Others doubled down, acquiring more land while prices were depressed. From Rome's perspective, both reactions were acceptable, as long as revenue kept flowing. Governments at the provincial level walked a tightrope. Pushed too hard, and unrest followed. Pushed too softly, and Rome replaced you. Governors hosted meetings behind closed doors, reviewing figures by oil lamplight, aware that shortfalls could end careers, or lives. Foreign markets reacted subtly. Trade slowed in volatile regions. Credit tightened. Roman financiers began pricing risk into loans issued far from the capital. Economists would later note this pattern again and again across history. When political uncertainty rises, capital becomes cautious. For ordinary people, the consequences were immediate. Food insecurity worsened. Migration increased as families left ancestral villages in search of work elsewhere. Cities swelled with laborers, driving wages down further. The math never favored them. And still, Rome demanded more. What unsettled observers most wasn't the numbers. It was the silence. No announcements. No warnings. Just a steady tightening, until something snapped. The moment the wider financial world realized something was wrong didn't come with a single decree. It came through accumulation. Missed payments. Delayed shipments. Reports that didn't reconcile. Rome's accountants noticed discrepancies that couldn't be explained by weather or war alone. Behind closed doors, imperial advisors debated whether the problem was administrative failure or structural exhaustion. Some argued the provinces were underperforming. Others feared the opposite, that they were being overmined, drained beyond recovery. The solution Rome chose was familiar. Enforce harder. Collect faster. Tax collectors became more aggressive. Penalties increased. Legal appeals narrowed. For local elites, this created opportunity and risk in equal measure. Those aligned with Roman authority gained protection. Those who hesitated lost favor. Boardrooms of the ancient world, courtyards, villas, temple chambers, buzzed with calculation. Ordinary citizens felt the escalation viscerally. A missed payment now meant confiscation. A dispute meant public humiliation. Families sold tools, livestock, even heirlooms to stay afloat. The economy had become less about production and more about survival. Journalists and chroniclers captured the mood with restraint. Words like unease, burden, and tension appeared more frequently in records. Analysts, philosophers, teachers, legal scholars, began questioning whether the system was sustainable. Not morally. Financially. Foreign observers paid attention. Neighboring regions adjusted policies, wary of similar unrest. Roman markets priced in instability from Judea and surrounding provinces. Confidence thinned. This was the environment into which radical ideas traveled quickly. Messages about debt forgiveness, shared resources, and moral economies spread not because they were poetic, but because they felt practical. By now, the empire's ledger balanced only on paper. On the ground, something far more dangerous was building, a population that had nothing left to lose. By the final years of this system's peak tension, the economy of Jesus' era had stopped pretending to be neutral. It was no longer just a structure people lived within. It was a force they endured. Every transaction carried moral weight. Every coin felt watched. For ordinary families, faith became inseparable from economics. Temple obligations were still enforced, but now they collided openly with survival. Some paid religious taxes before feeding their children, fearing spiritual consequences more than hunger. Others quietly stopped coming, slipping to the margins of society where shame replaced obligation. Religious leaders were divided. Some defended the system as divinely ordered, arguing that stability, even painful stability, was preferable to chaos. Others worried that faith itself was being hollowed out, transformed into a payment plan rather than a refuge. Private conversations reflected doubt rarely spoken in public. Investors and elites sensed the shift. Land holdings were secure, but social legitimacy was eroding. Wealth protected them from Rome, but not from resentment. Analysts of the era noticed something subtle and alarming: productivity wasn't rising anymore. Extraction had reached its ceiling. Foreign markets interpreted the signals correctly. Confidence didn't collapse, but it thinned. Long-term investment slowed. Rome could still enforce compliance, but at higher cost, with lower returns. Economically, the system was aging. Into this moment stepped voices that reframed the entire equation. Teachings that questioned not just who held wealth, but why. That spoke of debt as bondage, not balance. Of power as responsibility, not entitlement. These ideas didn't threaten Rome immediately. But they unsettled something deeper, the belief that the system was inevitable. What history often misses is how quiet the final realization was. There was no single economic collapse, no dramatic ledger failure that forced Rome to rewrite the system overnight. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, in the way people began to think differently about money itself. Ordinary citizens started measuring wealth less by accumulation and more by relief. A cancelled debt felt richer than a profitable season. Shared meals carried more security than stored grain. These weren't rebellions. They were adaptations, small, human recalibrations in response to a system that had overreached. Governments noticed the shift but misunderstood it. Roman officials focused on enforcement metrics, not morale. Revenue still arrived, so the model appeared functional. Analysts, however, sensed the long-term danger. An economy can survive inequality. What it can't survive is disbelief, when people no longer accept the logic that binds them to it. For elites, the lesson came too late. Land remained theirs, but influence weakened. Wealth insulated them from punishment, not from irrelevance. Faith institutions faced a reckoning as well. When spiritual authority is entangled too closely with financial pressure, trust becomes fragile. Once broken, it is difficult to tax back into existence. Foreign markets absorbed the lesson more quietly. Capital flowed elsewhere. Risk was reassessed. Empires, investors learned again, don't fall when they are poor. They falter when their systems stop making sense to the people inside them. The economy of Jesus' era ultimately revealed a timeless truth: money is never just money. It is a story people agree to believe. When that story demands too much and gives too little, it doesn't end in numbers. It ends in meaning. And that realization, subtle, unsettling, enduring, outlived the empire that inspired it. In the end, the economy of Jesus' era reminds us that financial systems rarely collapse under the weight of numbers alone. They unravel when the distance between power and people grows too wide to justify. Rome mastered taxation, control, and extraction, but it underestimated belief, dignity, and the quiet resilience of those living inside its ledgers. Across centuries, the mechanics remain familiar. Wealth concentrates. Authority rationalizes. Ordinary lives absorb the cost. And somewhere beneath the balance sheets, a deeper question forms, about fairness, purpose, and who the economy is truly built for. The global economy today may look more advanced, more digital, more abstract. But its foundations are still human. And like every system before it, its future will depend not just on how much it collects, but on how much meaning people are willing to give it.